Before we get into it, I need to warn you. The topic discussed here may ruffle some feathers, and if you feel the need to click off this video, then clearly you're not ready to hear what needs to be said. Hello again. I'm aware this is a controversial topic to get into, because it's always talked about. Let me say the quiet part out loud. You live like a slave, and you chose it. But I'm going to rewind history and talk about how we got here. I think I'm easily 10 years or so late talking about this. Why is that? Because this topic was big back in 2015 and 2016 when the whole thing was the big problem. The thing is though, when we talk about slavery we always dilute it down to slavery bad, or in correlated topics, communism bad. When now? We have a faction of people who embrace communism yet reject slavery like hypocrites. I'm not saying slavery is intrinsic to communism. I'm just saying you typically don't have one without the other. On the other hand, we choose to view such things in black and white, refusing to acknowledge slavery actually is complex and comes in different forms. Sure, it's a spicy take, but there are forms of bondage. Economic, ideological, even voluntary, that don't resemble the historical horrors we associate with slavery. There's also a kind of servitude regarding discipline, duty, self-sacrifice, that builds civilizations. We demonize that too, while embracing systems that enslave us in all but name. We demonize slavery as an idea, while living as slaves ourselves, just under different masters. In fact, it's worse realizing many of us Americans grew up and were raised to hate our country. We blame nonsense as the problem, when in reality we've been baited. But such topics are left for a future video. In regards to slavery, I'm probably the first to admit the hard truth that even in the modern America we are slaves. Again, slavery comes in different forms, and to paint the concept itself as inherently bad makes us ignorant and unwilling to understand fundamental facts. We are humans, capable of having independent thoughts. And what do we do with it? Instead of using that freedom to question, we numb ourselves with convenience. Now allow me to go ahead and formally educate about the concept and complexity of slavery as well as the history of it, for as far back as I can find. The whole shtick. If we boil it down, slavery historically takes two forms. One, the brutal, dehumanizing kind we rightfully condemn. The other, a contractual form of servitude based on mutual agreement and legal accountability. This second form isn't about exploitation. It's a way for someone to repay a debt over time through labor with rights attached. The owner, or let's say custodian, is legally responsible for the person's housing, health, and basic welfare. If the servant gets hurt, they're obligated to provide care, and it doesn't strip away dignity. It's not, you're less than human. In fact, in some fictional settings like the imperial slaves and elite dangerous, this kind of system has rules, rights, and structure. That's basically what I'm describing. Now the second kind of slavery, the one we all rightfully fear, is far more brutal. Forget Hollywood's dramatizations. They sell emotion, not accuracy. If anything, the reality was often worse. Take three of the darkest versions humanity came up with. First, forced labor, like plantation slavery in the 1800s. These slaves were treated as property, yes, but also as investments. They were fed, clothed, and kept healthy only to preserve productivity. Second, sexual slavery. Women trafficked in brothels across time, ancient or modern, were often exploited with no protection or support. Pregnancy meant abandonment. Refusal meant punishment. They were discarded the moment they lost profit potential. Third, conscripts. Men thrown into meat grinder wars like in Stalinist Russia, given a single rifle for every 3 men. No training, no choice. Just used, then erased. Which of these is worse depends on the lens. But they all strip away agency, dignity, and life. By the 1700s and 1800s in America, slavery had crystallized into this exploitative form. Few, if any, experienced the contractual model. And despite popular narratives, anyone regardless of ancestry, religion, or class could find themselves in chains. Let's take a deep dive from history. What's the earliest recorded history of slavery we in the modern day so passionately despise? Sumer of 3000 BCE. Realizing I'm talking about slavery, Generally, it doesn't really branch out beyond exploitation, lack of autonomy, and abuse. Moreover, any laws regarding it were always protecting the slave owners over the actual slaves. So in 3000 BCE, the men didn't seem very prominent among the slave class. Just women and children. But the women and children were used for working, and women were used for sex as well. Moreover, the slaves here were nothing more than property. But there are some outliers in history worth mentioning. How so? Ancient Egypt, 1500 BCE. Contrary to modern Western propaganda, it wasn't armies of slaves who built the pyramids. It was actually skilled laborers and farmers who worked on the off-season. Imagine my shock realizing that recently. Perhaps I'll make a video talking about how the American education failed America. Regardless, the slaves of Egypt were war captives from Canaan, Libya, Nubia, and other regional locations. We can argue that was bad, but hang in there for me. Other slaves were criminals or people who owed money or sparked rebellion. Lastly, it was children sold into slavery because of famine. Now what sounds worse to you? The kids sold into slavery, obviously. However, unlike the slavery we are taught, slavery in Egypt offered upward mobility. Slaves could work to genuinely obtain freedom. Convenient how this wasn't in your 6th grade textbook, isn't it? Let's take a gander at ancient China in 1600 to 1046 BCE. In the Shang dynasty, slaves were mainly criminals, war captives, or people who sold themselves or children to pay off debts. Beyond the generic slavery in ancient China, slaves had an interesting quirk. Slaves were sometimes sacrificed in rituals. Moreover, unlike the slaves we think, slaves in China were viewed as part of the family. What's interesting is how Wang Mang tried to shut the whole thing down, but that failed. Mainly it was because slavery was seen as a hierarchical harmony, or a natural order. In ancient India, 1500 to 500 BCE, again here slaves were war captives and criminals. But here people could be gifted for dowries or royal exchanges. Moreover, India seemed to take the concept of slavery as less of a bad thing as well. How so? Slavery wasn't seen as inherently evil, and in fact the term slave was softened in ancient texts for servants. Here, slaves could become free as well with good behavior or enough years. But lifelong servitude wasn't unusual either. What's crazy? Servants here had regulations protecting them. Yes, in some cases, ancient India gave more legal protections to its servants than we do our modern gig workers. Let's jump to Greece and Rome. The year is 500 to 100 BCE. The Greeks rarely enslaved other Greeks but barbarians in trade or captured in war. Barbarians in this era were basically non-Greek people. These slaves worked domestically but also as skilled laborers and state slaves. However, it wasn't uncommon these slaves would earn freedom through the process of manumission. They could eventually become citizens themselves and earn wealth. In Rome, slaves were about 30 to 40% of the population, and they practically did everything. Agriculture, mining, domestic service, education, medicine, and construction. Some served in gladiator schools or Roman households. A few were secretaries and administrators. You know, you could just imagine how explosive Rome's downfall was when more than a quarter of their entire population were not only slaves, but did literally everything. The mines and farms were brutal, yet here in Rome slaves had upward mobility as well, genuine formal paths to freedom. So far, how bad does slavery really sound? Because when we think about slavery, we expect worse than this. In the Islamic caliphates during the 7th century to the 1800s, noticing a pattern yet? Across centuries, slavery often looks eerily similar no matter the time or place. How so? In this time, slaves were non-Muslim, captured during wars or raids. Children born into slavery were eventually freed through manumission. And people could also be sold into slavery to pay off debts or as a form of punishment. The key takeaway here is that slaves were used militarily, but could eventually gain power and create dynasties. Female slaves often became concubines, relationships that weren't always consensual. But if the father was a Muslim, their children were born free and legitimate. In the labor forces, however, slavery wasn't as prominent, but it still happened. Besides that, once again slaves had protections, this time both legally and religiously. And they too could become free with manumission. Again, even under religious empires, slavery was complex. layered with both brutality and structure. Taking a look at the medieval era, in 500 to 1400 CE, this is where the term slave slowly became more of a contract. How so? To start, we have serfdom. These aren't slaves on paper, but they might have as well be anyways. What do I mean? They weren't free, but they were required to provide labor, goods, or services to their lord on the land they were bound to. Moreover, the land could be sold, and as such, they too would have to go with it. This form of slavery is truly despicable, because it was usually generational and inescapable. This was economic slavery. Otherwise, there was true slavery, just not as commonly unless you look at the Slavic regions, British Isles, Spain, and Italian city-states. At first, Christians even enslaved one another until the church prohibited it, then promoted slavery on non-Christian or Catholic people, and rationalized slavery on religious grounds. Eventually, up to about 1100, slavery was abolished. I say that lightly because it was actually replaced with economic tenant farming and wage labor. Chains without shackles. But still chains. In the African kingdoms of 900 to 1800 CE, slavery followed the same patterns as before. Criminals, war captives, people selling themselves to pay off debts, etc. I'm aware I don't mention much in this segment, but it's because any real difference here is minimal at best and not significant to be worthy to mention. However, the next segment will be a baller. How so? To briefly mention before I do, slavery here expanded beyond local borders, just not on a global scale. Not yet. The transatlantic slave trade, 15th to 18th century, this one is a big component to why we absolutely despise slavery in the modern world. It's as big of a topic as Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. How so? This is when, referring to what I've talked about so far, slavery became global. Moreover, it began to expose the deep-rooted corruption in humanity. How so? Because based on what's talked about in this video, slavery wasn't dehumanizing. Minus some outliers. Slavery before this was more localized and arguably beneficial. Was never generally used as a tool to exploit. Because when we think of slavery, we think zero upward mobility, autonomy, rights, or protections. When we think of slavery, we imagine our mind, body, and soul being exploited with no genuine conscience of our humanity. The transatlantic slave trade is what changed the world along with Nazi Germany. During this time, we have to remember that at first, slaves came from war captives, people who sold themselves to pay off debts or selling their children or orphaned children. When the Americas and Europe became involved, the demand for slaves grew exponentially. Demand grew so much tribes in Africa would start wars just to get war captives to ship them off to foreign countries. Before, slavery was just part of local culture. But by this point, a slave was less than human. Again, wars were started to get more slaves. The takeaway here is that people who lived under governments doing this were fine, except for those who were criminals or who couldn't pay debts and so had to sell themselves or their children. In the Americas and the EU at the time, this is when chattel slavery was born. And this was when culture among an entire society and people died. Here in this world you had no upward mobility, no rights, protections, not even family unless they came with you and you miraculously survived. The transatlantic slave trade was the turning point of the world, and to this day, people still feel resentment. One of the worst things about it? You weren't just a war captive or a criminal. You were also a family member who could have sold themselves into slavery to pay off a debt, only to find out you sold yourself into perpetual lifelong servitude. To be born only to die because you didn't meet your quota of cotton for the day in a foreign country that didn't give any concern for your humanity. Moreover, slavery before was a method used to pay back dues or pay for crimes. This kind of slavery instead became solely based on skin color alone. From the 19th century to today, slavery was legally abolished. Or was it? Because if you take a closer look, trafficking, forced labor, debt bondage, and prison labor, they still exist. They're just rebranded. And that brings me back to something I touched on before. Wage slavery. Wage slavery means your entire life depends on wages. Especially when those wages are low, the work is dehumanizing, and you have no real control over the terms. Now I get it. It's not real slavery, right? The term sounds dramatic, But if America actually acknowledged wage slavery for what it is, we'd have riots. We'd ask, why did we fight the Civil War? What's the 13th Amendment even for? See, wage slavery is the open secret. Nobody talks about it because they'd have to admit it's still happening. Critics say comparing this to historical slavery is disrespectful. But if you're stuck in a cycle with no protection, no mobility, no autonomy, wouldn't that be a kind of slavery as well? Let me paint a picture. You've got a family emergency? Clock in. You're sick with a 102-degree fever? Clock in. If you show up and get caught by an health inspector, you're fired. If you don't show up, you're fired. And I've been there. One day I was genuinely sick, and I should have stayed home. But I was told, bring a doctor's note or come in. So I did. I kept everything sanitary, washed like crazy. But if a health inspector had walked in, we'd have been shut down and I would have been blamed for it. Luckily, the place has new management now. But that's the game, that's the system. So now here's the truth. The average American, especially Gen Y, Z, and A, we're screwed unless something changes. Why? Because your paycheck? It's not your future. It's your leash. Half goes to rent. Then you've got insurance, gas, debt, student loans. And what's left? Groceries, maybe? A social life? Forget it. Trash food is getting expensive too. And if you want out, don't become an influencer. Become skilled. Fix roofs, unclog pipes, mow lawns. Build something real. That's how you break the chain. That's how you say, I'm done subscribing to the system. Let it collapse. Then someone, maybe you, rebuilds it. I leave you with this one final question. Based on what I've talked about so far, are we afraid to admit slavery wasn't always evil? Or are we more afraid of confronting the truth of human nature? Hey you! Hit subscribe! And don't forget to turn on the bell notification for your daily upload alerts. Give it a share. Leave a like and make a comment.